All right.
All right, and we're live.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Virtual Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU and to the 5th episode of the Shift event series, which will focus on work. Thank you for tuning in this afternoon. I'd like to start off by thanking our co-sponsors of the series, Knight Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and Civic Signals. My name is Jessica Coffey, and I'm the Associate Director here at IPK. The Shift is a series that sets out to explore the social implications of the shifts in public life that we have been collectively experiencing since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Rather than offering advice, we aim to open up a space for sharing experiences and asking important questions. Our discussion today will focus on how this pandemic has shifted the structure, meaning, and places of work. It will explore the ways the pandemic has accelerated and illuminated inequalities in the workplace, including class, racial, gender, and digital divides. Our panelists will offer their insights on how to create material and digital workspaces that reflect values of anti-racism, gender equity, and social justice. Before I introduce our moderator today, I want to thank the IPK team, Zari Lum, Ari Vel Figueroa, and Sam Dijon for their time and energy, as well as a very special thanks to Rosa Colon Guerra of Soda Pop Comics, who was live illustrating for us today. You can find more of Rosa's work on Instagram or Facebook at Soda Pop Comics. I'd also like to take a moment to underline IPK's commitment to acknowledging that NYU is located on the unceded lands of the Lenape peoples, to acknowledging the Lenape community, and to committing the long process of working to dismantling the long, ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Finally, I want to express solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as all people seeking safe, secure, and dignified living conditions across the globe. Now, our moderator today, Melissa Fisher, is a cultural anthropologist and a visiting scholar at the Institute for Public Knowledge. She is an associate researcher in the Global Foresight Project, based out of Stockholm University's Department of Anthropology, and an adjunct professor in public and international affairs at Columbia University. Melissa's expertise lies in organizational studies with a focus on globalization, socio-cultural practices, gender, technology, and work. She is currently working on her next book, which focuses on the future of work in the age of pandemics. As a quick reminder, please post your questions throughout the event in the Q&A section on Zoom. And now I pass the mic to Melissa to intro our panelists and get us started. Thank you and enjoy.
Thank you, Jessica. It's a pleasure and honor to be here today with three very esteemed panelists who come from rather different backgrounds and areas of expertise. You can read about their bios that are extensive and their various accomplishments on our website, but I just want to take a few minutes to introduce them and then to give you a backdrop and framework for thinking about the future of work today. Ana Oliveira has been a voice and a force for change, for improving the lives of those people in the greatest needs for more than 30 years. She's president and CEO of the New York Women's Foundation, and their mission is to create an equitable and just future for women and families. David Grayson is a professor of sociology, communication, and the faculty director of the Urban Studies program at the University of Pennsylvania, and is a current visiting scholar with me here at NYU IPK. He's currently writing a book on non-standard urban workspaces in the new economy. And last but not least is Lisa Chomley, who is a principal at Gensler. She's an architect. Her career has spanned the globe, working in London, Doha, and Abu Dhabi. She has taught architectural design at Howard University and other spaces, and has written extensively on race, diversity, and equity in the office in the midst of the pandemic. So I just want to take a moment to frame today's discussion as I see it. When today's media, workplace analysts, and bloggers discuss the future of work today in the age of the pandemic and now the emergence into the post-pandemic era, They typically emphasize the disruption in the place of work and the future of the office in the wake of millions of people working from home and now returning. This account is by far the dominant one. So central to the discussion is often the home office, hybrid work models, use of technology, virtual meetings, and shared working spaces, all realms where the office no longer makes a difference or will be radically different in its purpose, and where to a large degree, the only type of worker that matters is the mostly white professional or knowledge worker. This account privileges a corporate culture over the jobs in which it rests. In brief, it is about the predominantly white male-dominated transnational professional labor markets in finance and tech, rather than also including the lower wage markets in factory, service, and gig work composed primarily of women and people of color. So the work of janitors, maids, cleaners, cafeteria workers, and nannies often appear to have little to do with public discussions about the future of work. This is, of course, changing, and this is what we're going to be talking about in large part today. And yet, as all we know, the pandemic has made visible the sharp divide between essential workers who risk their lives going to work and those professionals who could more easily avoid becoming ill by safely remaining working at home. So I've thought, as I've worked on my own book over the last year and a half, a couple of questions that are going to be the backdrop for today's discussion. Might the recent resurgence of political protests from Black Lives Matter and related social movements alter the structure of the labor market and work? Might the hyper focus, at least in the media, on the future of the office and knowledge worker reinscribe and reproduce class, race, and other hierarchies, or more optimistically, the reinvention of work, hybrid models, new ecosystems enable actually more diversity, more equity and inclusion in the world of work? So these are some of the key questions or ideas that are framing the backdrop of today's discussion, and why I brought an academic, an architect, and philanthropist today to sort of create a discussion to sort of bridge the silos to some extent that exist in different discussions of work at play. So I want to ask, just to open up, each person has a very distinct area of expertise and perspective to talk about what they see as the current state of work and the labor market in the current moment as we are emerging out of this pandemic. And I wanted to start with David, who has written extensively about shared working spaces and has some sense of the history of the turn towards remote work, and open it up to him to give us a kind of perspective on the history and the current state, and then move on to both Lisa and Anna. So I hand over the microphone to David.
All right. Thank you so much, Melissa. And thank you, TIPK, for inviting us to speak about this important topic. It's true that remote work exploded during COVID-19, but it didn't start with COVID-19. Gallup reported that the percentage of employed Americans working remotely during some part of the week in the prior year had increased from 39% in 2012 to 43% in 2016, along with an increase in the proportion of those working remotely 4 or 5 days a week. According to Gallup, 31% of US mobile workers spend 80% or more of their time working remotely, and did so in 2016, and that was up from 24% in 2012. So remote work was nothing new when COVID began. However, in the years prior to COVID, remote work was undoubtedly easier, although it was still a challenge. Even before COVID, people working from home in the city shared their small apartments with their spouses, with their children, and with elderly relatives. Digital nomads had to sort of jump across the city on public transit and city streets looking for a free outlet or a bathroom. People who chose to work in co-working spaces did so because they wanted a division between home and work. And people went to meetups that were designed for people who work alone in order to work alongside other people in public spaces like the New York Public Library here in New York, or to socialize in cafes where they could have the sort of water cooler talk during meetups that they were not able to have outside of the traditional work environment. What COVID did do is that it demanded that we work remotely, but with none of the resources that sustained remote work before COVID. And so cafes and coffee shops and lunch spots, co-working spaces were closed, libraries were closed, daycare was truncated. Many schools shifted to remote learning, and that would have gotten kids out of the house prior to COVID. That was no longer an option during COVID for many parents. And so people were forced to work in the home with spouses and children that were also learning and working remotely. And this was also, of course, during the pandemic, when there were sort of plenty more stresses on the family that turned the terrain of home into a work environment, in addition to an environment of care. And so for all these reasons, COVID wound up not necessarily inventing a new remote work, but exacerbating the challenges of remote work that had already existed.
Thanks. I want to turn to Anna, who has really focused on the lives of women, women of color, the disadvantaged, marginalized communities and their families, and ask you to sort of build on what David was talking about sort of the home, family life, and the future of work from the work that you've done at the New York Women's Foundation.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you so much for having us in this panel. Thank you to IPK. This is such a necessary conversation. And I appreciate that we can have a more wholesome conversation about it with the different participants. So so I'm going to say that at the foundation, we are very, very close to our grantee partners. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is really the work of our grantees, the realities of their work, but also the realities of the lives of community members in where they are embedded, the communities that they come from, that they serve. We tend to find organizations that themselves are first responders to their communities, even though they are not EMTs and they are not, 911 respondents. They are first responders in people's lives. So the first thing I would say is that we want to talk about the work of people that primarily have occupied sectors of the economy that they don't have the ability to work remotely. So the folks that work in the care industry, child care, adult care, the folks that work in the service industry, in restaurants, in cleaning and maintenance services, the folks that deliver food, the folks that deliver medicine, the folks that deliver packages, folks whose workplace is not necessarily an office. And when it is, it's at the service of those who actually occupy offices. So we saw enormous disruption in those sectors, and we saw that a very large number of women lost their jobs. There's about 3 or 4 million women that got out of the economy and are having a very hard time coming back. So that part of work for women, I'm talking about primarily women of color, certainly New York and the greater metropolitan area, but also throughout the country, and poor women financially speaking of very limited means. Otherwise very strong and very ingenious, but financially speaking, limited means. So not only there was a retraction, those jobs, many of them disappeared, but women found themselves with other jobs. And I want to say that the concept of work, perhaps one thing that we can exploit in a positive way is the broadening of what we consider work. So for instance, how many times did we hear that now people had to become teachers to their children? I mean, David was talking about that. And how many times, not just teachers, but continuing to cook, continue to maintain their homes, and now having, as you said, David, everybody in the home and doing that work. So traditionally, work that doesn't happen in the marketplace outside of the home is usually more invisible. It's a typical, invisibility, and it's very genderized. It tends to fall in the shoulders of women. Now in this pandemic, all of a sudden we realize that's, oh my God, that is real. I'm at home and there's all that stuff happening for, others who are not women, noticing that. But women having double and triple loads. For the first time, we see in the national conversation, again, it's actually not the first time, but a return of the conversation around the care economy. And the care economy is an economy that became essential. We also, oh my God, we need this care economy. And this care economy now that has been marginalized as a non-important professional sector, hardly ever seen as a professional, hardly ever compensated, really underpaid, and has sustained the production part of the economy, the reproduction of human beings, which is the care economy is an integral part of that. So in that sense, I think that there's a good shining the light, but it will not result in, I'm going to say, a rebuilding of our sense of work and of our sense of the purpose of it. It will not make any difference if our policies don't change. Policies around the dignity of those professions, the value of those professions, the compensation of those professions, and the mainstreaming that's real work. So I wanted to say that. We also hear that because the care economy is so frail in that sense, that the choices that women are making of not returning to other forms of work and staying with the care economy, unpaid care economy, sustaining their children and their families. So I am very heartened that we all have to grapple with that now. Not just women have to grapple with that. We all have to grapple with that because creating a sustainable society. So a couple of other things, and that is that.
Ask you, Anna, I want to come back to you because you have so much to say.
Absolutely.
And all of your comments
are point for me to stop,
especially about the care economy. I think I could speak to each of you individually for well over an hour. I want to bring Lisa into the conversation. She's been, very actively thinking about the issues about race, building, and return to work. She's written some interesting ideas about how the office could be a space of equity, which would be very different than some of what we've been talking about here. So I wanted to just turn to you and ask, especially as somebody who imagines and designs and builds offices and thinks about the interior, the exterior, the place of buildings in cities, if you can talk from your vantage point, Lisa, as a principal, as an architect, as somebody who's really thinking about these things, what do you see as the current state of work, perhaps the office and other workspaces, as we emerge again from this kind of COVID to post-COVID moment?
Yeah, I was thinking we have spoken many times for more than an hour, so just thinking of your comment to Anna that we absolutely do all.
Lisa and I have been talking for about a year or two extensively, yeah.
So yeah, and actually, in fact, brought together by COVID, right, and kind of our ability to be in these virtual spaces together. So that's just a great thing thinking about. So yeah, thanks for the introduction, Melissa. And I guess the thing to frame about it is that I'm at the kind of speculative end of this conversation, right? That I work at an organization that is always thinking about space and human interaction and what that effect is. So I guess my comments will be sometimes at the scale of the city or scale of the office, but the topics are kind of top of mind for us. So yeah, to the initial point that Melissa made is as a kind of foundational point, the argument that we've made over the years, going back to the office is already an equitable decision, right? That if in general, we're talking about, I guess, different from Anna's discussion of the larger marketplace. I'm definitely talking about people who do go to an office for their work, whatever that is. That could be the janitor in the office. It's kind of the scale. It doesn't actually matter what the role is in the office, but the fact that people have an office to go to, that's already equitable. I mean, I think right now people are now potentially limited by their, do they have a table? At the start of the pandemic, I had colleagues who wouldn't have their camera on because they're working from their bed, right? They didn't actually have a desk, or the one horizontal surface was used by one of their 3 roommates, right? So I think that the fact that people can return to a place that has the same table, the same computer, the same internet service, like that is already equitable, right? So what you can do and how you can use your talents is not limited by something in your house. You have an equitable platform. So I think that's been a foundational idea for us internally as an organization of how do we all get back to the office so we can do the thing we do, and also for our clients that it's important, right, that the office itself is a kind of an existence of equity. There's that. Another thing to talk about is and I guess we can kind of talk about what's an amenity and social impact and how people think about the workplace. But in a sense that a question could be, we are thinking about why aren't our offices more connected to their neighborhoods, right? That instead of, and one thing that comes up now, and I did a talk, it was sort of focused on government clients, but we were talking about the fact that we've realized over the past year that we can deliver lots of services remotely, right? So you maybe no longer need to go to an NBC or a DMV to do things. You can do it by post, by virtual. And so then what that means is we maybe have buildings with lots of space on the ground floor they're open. Like we have these lobbies for lots of people to wait, but if people aren't waiting in there anymore, that's an interesting design proposition, right? So you have spaces that can become public and shared amenities and community catalysts and things like that. So I think there's when people don't need to come to the office for some things, you maybe have space you can reclaim and do other things with it. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about. And one thing definitely here in San Francisco, there's already a requirement for when people are building projects to provide kind of privately provided but publicly accessed space. And so when you're walking down the street, typically you think of most cities, you walk down the streets and the lobbies are independent. They belong to that building and you don't go into them. But imagine a city where those spaces are actually public. They're built by that owner perhaps, but it's a public space to sit and have a coffee and do something. So that's already something that happens in San Francisco, but that's a thing to think about, that the office isn't this disconnected piece, but it actually has a community engagement interaction space. And so then another thought of, obviously becomes a big topic now, it's kind of wellness, right? That Gensler does a lot of research, and we have a lot of research on workplace. And we did a number of surveys over last year. So beginning of the pandemic, towards the end of the pandemic, and then now again, kind of post-vaccine of the pandemic. And you could sort of track the reasons people didn't go in the office, had to do with security and wellness, and kind of the obvious reasons why people were more comfortable being at home. So there is definitely for us an idea about elevating wellness, and so that people are more aware now of kind of what space am I in, whether it's simple things like I can walk upstairs and not take the elevator all the time. Are the windows operable? Can we have spaces that are indoor and outdoor, so that these come into the workspaces that we make of people saying, why can't I work outside on a deck during the afternoon, right? So can spaces have more access to outdoor space? So I think the idea of elevating wellness comes up, and it's definitely kind of spurred by a COVID consideration. And along with that, of calling them like sustainable choices. And I don't actually mean only choices that have some kind of green metric, but it's possible to be local and be sustainable. We have a project that we're doing where we decided not only would we reduce the amount of virgin timber on the project, but have no virgin timber on the project. And we did that by working with local salvage companies, right? So it was not only a sustainable choice in terms of timber resources, but a kind of local engagement with craftspeople to understand, like, how can you help us achieve this goal? So it's possible to make a choice that is sustainable and also super hyper local and hyper connected to the craftspeople and the work people in the place where you're making, right? That's another piece that's important to us. And I think beyond even sustainable, I think that if we again think about connection to the community in a physical way, that how can we even more engage with all the craftspeople where we are. So I think that the idea of design isn't just we buy a thing from someplace else, we can design with someone from that community. So that's a thing that to think about too.
I love that idea. That's absolutely fantastic. I want to turn to David and ask him, you've written about sort of the disruption between place and work, and then the importance of place, especially you wrote an article in 2019 about sort of the importance of shared working spaces. And I wonder if you can talk about how those spaces have or haven't changed. And maybe, you know, to Lisa's point, how they we're rethinking and redesigning spaces. Is the fate of shared working spaces optimistic, pessimistic, changing? You're muted. That's always
So-
happened, right?
That's the, yeah, you're on mute will be the,
The on mute
will be the catchphrase of the
mantra.
of the pandemic. Yeah, so as we've been discussing, the inequities of the social fabric were further revealed during COVID. The affluent classes fled to the suburbs, fled in New York City. They fled to upstate New York. They fled to Airbnb rentals outside the city. Those who remained in the city shared their small apartments with their spouses, their children, and elderly relatives. I have a graduate student who shared a studio apartment with her boyfriend, and when they both had meetings at the same time, one was stuck making calls in the bathroom of their apartment. Not everybody had up-to-date devices, and not everybody had broadband access. This made McDonald's and Starbucks parking lots workplaces for the desperate, and it especially affected poor urban neighborhoods and rural communities. Working remotely often meant being on Zoom or Google Meet or Microsoft Teams, revealing the interior settings where we live, as unequal as they are, leaving those without professionally cleaned apartments feeling naked before the screen. These technologies forced us to renegotiate our professional and personal boundaries, which had suddenly melted into air. Meanwhile, co-working spaces that had already been sort of out of the financial reach of quite a lot of workers who work alone, particularly contingent workers. They remain sort of out of reach. My hope is that in the wake of at least in places like New York City, as we see the value of commercial real estate decline, as people move toward and companies move toward more hybrid ways of working, this will lead to an increase, an explosion of co-working spaces, and some of those might be affordable for working class and lower middle class workers. I agree with Lisa that there's also really creative things that we could do with underused office space in our cities. And so Lisa mentioned lobbies. We already live in a setting where even before COVID, many Midtown offices were closed at night and were closed on the weekends. And that leads to a surplus of space that can be used by other workers during the week after the working day or on the weekends. And then finally, we need to think about the way that industry leaders will have to make workspaces available. We'll still need to make workspaces available outside the home for their workers that they demand to work remotely. And so even if a company like Microsoft decides to have its employees quote unquote work from home, as Lisa and Anna pointed out, working from home isn't an option for all employees. And if companies aren't going to provide those workspaces in traditional offices, then they need to be able to give vouchers to allow people to work in co-working spaces or other available work environments where they will be able to experience equity, fairness, and productivity.
Yeah, I want to just remind the audience that if you haven't already, if you started to have questions for the panelists, please start to add them in the Q&A. And I want to turn now for the last sort of 15 minutes of our conversation before opening it up to Q&A to really sort of build on what David was talking about. You know, what are the kinds of solutions, recommendations, insights that we have on how to create more equitable, diverse workspaces, public, private, and city spaces as well, right? A number of you, each of you in some way has talked about a kind of infrastructure that is either missing or needs to be built, whether it's an infrastructure of care or a technological kind of infrastructure or the infrastructure that supports buildings and cities. So I thought maybe we could think more broadly about what your insights and recommendations, but in particular, what do we need? I mean, both in the context of the US, because this has been a mostly US focused conversation, but perhaps more broadly, because we do live in a largely global economy and world. And I wanted to turn to Anna now, and maybe you can sort of build on some of the points. And I know that you're so embedded in thinking about women and families in New York City in particular. Maybe you have some suggestions, recommendations that the foundation is already beginning to build on.
Okay, so I think that the issues around the care economy and the role of care in raising human beings and preserving our lives throughout, you know, the whole lifespan are really global issues. I mean, not all societies, there are countries that have provided more support. But overall, if we think about certainly the global South, that is an enormous issue, right? An infrastructure that is really missing and that needs to be there. But it is my hope that, you know, with the disruption of the pandemic, that we don't just go back to the past, that we move forward in with that expansion of the work, right? So more attention to the care economy. Particularly it's true for the US, we rank 35 amongst the 37 wealthiest nations as far as the child care and other elements of the care economy. I mean, that is a horrendous situation, right? So I think that we need, and I think workspaces, all kinds of workspaces, right? Across I'm going to say, different sectors of the economy. They could accommodate for that. They could expand for that, you know? So when we are talking about bringing work closer to where people are, right? Bringing public spaces, private spaces, we also can think about that in terms of the care economy, right? Bringing that more integratedly near or at workspaces and mainstream that so that the division between care economy and the other part of the economy, the production economy, so to speak, and the service economy is not so radical and it's not so far. I also think that it's an opportunity for us, you know, we have had an opportunity to have a clear sense of see all the functions that sustain our economy. And that has happened across the globe. It's an opportunity for us if we really want to build sustainable economies to really address all those sectors. So the issues around work documentation, undocumented workers that are nevertheless sustaining the functions in the economy throughout the pandemic. They were before, they continue throughout, and they continue in this post-pandemic beginning reality, right? It's an opportunity for us to move that. I think that, you know, listening to my dear co-panelists, in each of our areas, we can introduce these elements, you know? What do I mean? The elements of the real life of the workers. So be the caretaking elements, be the inequality around digital access, be flexibility. I just wanted to actually make a point about the issue of flexibility. The most requested aptitude for not-for-profits is flexibility. Foundations, we are very privileged in the sense that we're not first responders. So we can work in offices and we can work remotely. We can work on some kind of hybrid thing or whatever it might be. But not-for-profits on the ground tend to be service organizations, first responders. So I would love to see some investment and some understanding from the point of view of the not-for-profit work, right? From the point of view of the service delivery that happens in not-for-profits. And what does that look like? What could be improved there? I loved Lisa's comments about, space and the dynamics in space. Do they promote more equitable dynamics? Do they not? I would love including in the sense of the economy, in the sense of work that is valued. I would love to see that, not just around gender lines, certainly around racial, ethnic, and economic lines, but an expansion of our thinking on that. I believe that could be beneficial, not just for the United States, but beyond the United States. And finally, my last comment is that as we create hybrid spaces, for those of us that can occupy hybrid spaces, we just have to work with the hierarchy of that too. How do we make it be equally valid in a meeting, folks that are not physically together and folks that are remote, So even within the universe of those of us who can work in offices or other co-shared opportunities or spaces, even then, how do we deal with these issues of equity? And how do we integrate all the piercing, all the gazing that we have been able to have, given the disruption, into better solutions, more holistic solutions?
Yeah, I want to, Lisa, maybe, I know that you've thought about these things as somebody who's thinking about the organization and design of space. So can you maybe speak to sort of your thoughts about building in equity, diversity, and inclusion in the office and in these kinds of hybrid work environment experiences?
Yeah, it's interesting. A number of things came to my mind, like hyper-specific examples when Anna was speaking just now, and I'll give a few of them. One was, gender-neutral bathrooms, right? That's and that actually becomes a code issue, right? That currently our plumbing code is actually it's gendered. So, people always say, why do you go to like a mall or a stadium? There's more women outside waiting. But our plumbing code actually tells us to give fixtures based on gender. So that's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down. But like embedded in the code is some assessment of how many men and women need to use the bathrooms at different spaces. Okay. So that aside is kind of lots of movement in office space for sure to have gender neutral bathrooms. We don't care who you are, that's the room to do it in, right? So, and where we go with that. So it's really normal for us now when we do workplace projects to add gender neutral bathrooms. And that sometimes you often have to add bathrooms anyway with a renovation because the amount you get with the building, again, following the code from before, doesn't match your population. So it's not unusual anyway to add a bathroom. And now when we add a bathroom, it's gender neutral because who cares, right? So that's kind of one thing. Also, things like adding a wellness room, and that could be for anything, whether that's for breastfeeding, for a nap, or whatever it's for. But that room, it doesn't have a sign, but that room has a horizontal surface that's comfortable, has a sink, and has a cupboard and a fridge. And so, like, whoever needs a room for some wellness, there's a place to go to, right? So it's things like that, which we're not telling you what happens in this room, but we know that people need a room for a thing to happen. There are things like when we design, let's say, kitchens and places like that, that's a complicated space to make sure that everything is within reaching level for people of different heights, whether you're in a wheelchair, so that's a huge piece of the things that we all have to use. How do we make that literally accessible, right, for people to get to them. And so that when you have a team of people gathering, the person in the wheelchair doesn't feel like I have to get someone to help me get the mug, right? I can get my coffee myself and then we all sit together. So that idea of how different bodies move through the same space and how they can sit at the same table with ease is top of mind for us. You know, I think another thing that's coming up now a lot is the idea of neurodiversity, and that there are different kinds of people, different kinds of bodies in the space, and how do we have different spaces, that some are brighter and darker and louder and quieter. And so I think just all of that is, you know, I'm working on a project now. We just sort of finished the visioning section of it, which is when we spend a couple of weeks talking to lots of people in the company and understanding what are their hopes and needs for the new space. And this client is really focused on the hybrid office, what makes people come to the office, right? So what makes people want to leave home, right? And so now that we've established we all can do our work at home, why am I coming in? So there's that question. And then once I've decided to come in, how is that kind of friction free? And also when I'm in, how do I know who's in and how I connect with them? And so that's about, you know, screens to say Anna and David are in today, but Melissa is out. So how does everyone really feel like they're in the same virtual space? And so I think that's, we're working on it now. I think we're thinking of, but it's really top of mind of, and it is in our work now, that the idea of just the bodies in space, how it feels equitable, how our space is transformable. So if I think of our own office here in San Francisco, everyone arrives at, we call it the bridge, and that space is transformable. Sometimes it's us gathering, we have people come and give lectures. So like the idea that you make a space that changes over the day, over the week, that allows an organization to interact with itself differently, with the community differently. And so I think we think about this capacity to be diverse and accommodate diverse bodies and experiences at all these levels around the space, about components of the space. And so, yeah, does that answer the question?
Those are fantastic examples. I know, David, that you were thinking about sort of different kinds of social infrastructure that can accommodate what Anna pointed out, this whole sort of hyper focus, if you will, on the ideas of flexibility. So maybe you could speak to that a little bit, and other ideas that you might have on how we might build, you know, an infrastructure, which is obviously to some extent limited in this country, to say the least. So maybe we can move on to just also not only the idea of infrastructure, but what are the underlying policies that we could put forward, right, to sort of create the possibilities of building more equitable, diverse, inclusive infrastructure, both in the US, but also in the context perhaps more globally, if we can take it there.
Sure. I think one of the nice things that came out of the recent Biden infrastructure policy prescriptions was a rethinking of what is infrastructure. And you know, Eric Kleinenberg from IPK has written extensively about the importance of social infrastructure and the importance of funding all sorts of spaces of public amenity and use, from libraries to parks to other kinds of public spaces, and rethinking what new purposes they can serve. We need more of those spaces, and they need to be better resourced. And they ought to be part of any sort of infrastructure package. The Biden administration is also thinking extensively about broadband and broadband access as an equity issue, and as thinking about broadband as infrastructure. As I mentioned, particularly giving free access to broadband to poor communities in cities and to all rural areas across the country. And this is obviously something that other countries have managed to do, you know, much better than we have. Speaking of which, as Anna pointed out, there's a need for greater investment in universal childcare and after-care programs that allow parents to work without forcing them to sort of to be in a setting where they both care for their children badly and work badly. Dedicating their time to multitasking as opposed to concentrating on either deep work or the kind of intimate work that's required for raising particularly small children. And so there's a whole variety of policies that we could institute that involve sort of creative investment in social infrastructure that would allow what clearly is going to be a hybrid system of work where people go into an office once or twice a week, people work from home once a week, and then they work in some other sort of environment, whether it be a co-working space or a public library. And I think the best way to achieve equity is to have more and more of these spaces and more different kinds of spaces in order to serve lots of different populations with different needs. And clearly something that's happened as a result of Biden's election is that this has become now part of the conversation. It's at least become part of a debate over whether or not something should be considered infrastructure, whereas before this hadn't even been part of the discourse. And so I'm optimistic to see what happens. In the near future.
No, that's great. And I do think that, rethinking about what is infrastructure here is critical. Raising the debate to a national kind of conversation is enormously critical. Each of you works in a very different kind of space. David's in academia, Anna's in philanthropy, Lisa's in architect. And I brought you together in part because to some extent we have a common conversation and vocabulary. And on the other hand, we also are always kind of siloed. What are the ways in which different disciplines, different professions and industries, if you will, public, private, non-for-profit, how might we think about creating partnerships, links, networks to one another that would enable us to work more efficiently, provide more robust data, to create new kinds of frameworks, to create, as David just said, what will be and is already evolving into a largely hybrid work environment. I'm going to turn to Anna to think sort of more broadly, I know that you work with partners already at the foundation, right? So that you're already working, but how can we expand these networks? What is the work, if you will, that needs to be done here?
So, thank you for thinking that way, because, we're talking about hybrid workplaces, like in terms of office and other locations, right? But if we can think of hybrid, as you were saying, Melissa, in terms of sectors, right? In terms of different strengths that each sector brings to the table, right? And seeing what can be meshed there. So, it occurs to me that one of the possibilities that we might want to seize altogether and then fill in the blanks is moving to what we would say win-win approaches, right? We have had this, even if unspoken, but sometimes very directly spoken, this sense that there's an opposition between caretaking, I'm just even giving that example, but we can put other things there, and holding a job in a public kind of a setting, the private work and the public role, that they are in opposition somehow, right? That there is the working inside an office or one location versus working in multiple locations or in the privacy of one's home. So these things that used to be like either or this or that, it's a great opportunity for us to think of it's mixed, right? And different chemistries. So the same thing with sectors. Let me just say a very practical thing. We just talked about the enormous amount of, I can say in New York City, real estate, enormous amount. Corporations are shrinking and businesses shrinking their footprints. There's an enormous amount of empty office space. And not only some of it can be converted in affordable housing, and that's a governmental kind of an issue, but that should happen. But even as office space, not-for-profits, we all struggle with space, with affording space, having space. What would happen if large corporations or the private sector that has that extra space, not going to be able to sublet everything, because that's the whole point. People are shrinking. What would happen if we began to do mixed sector occupations? What would happen if, and I think it would be a very interesting exchange, because we have different strengths, right? The not-for-profit sector is very strong in the purpose of what it does. It is very strong with the impact that you want to have in the world. It tends to be less strong in running itself as a business. On the other hand, the private sector, the corporate sector, is very strong in running itself as a business, right? And it has a different kind of assets there, but it struggles with offering meaning and purpose to its workers, right? So there are very interesting opportunities there that could be really sustainable for the not-for-profit sector, with opportunities to co-locate at very low rent or for free. And this is all taxable write-offs for corporations. And for corporations, you know, bringing opportunities for volunteering, for engagement, for meaning to its staff, right, to its workers. So that's just a very practical thing that could advance. Who knows what else that could be exchanged in that chemistry, you know? So I think that partnership cross sectors is a very interesting thing, and we need to cross that boundary, you know? I'll just be very candid, somebody that has always worked in the not-for-profit sector, a little bit in government, tiny little bit, but we also have a lot to learn from some of the efficiencies that the private sector has become very good at over time. So I am interested in the win-win intersectorials, a different paradigm for us to look at.
Oh, that's great. I think those are wonderful ideas. Lisa, what kinds of partnerships are you working with? I know that you are in San Francisco and that there's some kinds of different partnerships that already are in play.
Yeah, I think we have partnerships in all different levels. I think it's the most direct way, which would be the most obvious way that we might work with academics like David and philanthropists like Anna is we have a large research institute, Gensler does, and we have done for over a decade across all different areas. And so the research isn't done just internally. We have lots of partners. Kind of one direct way is working with partners who have the same idea about an issue, whether that's around workplace or human experience or a particular practice area, or I am a co-director of an institute around equity in the built environment. So we have any number of topics that we research. So that's kind of one way that we partner with different people outside of our profession is we think about things together, and our goal is that how does that thinking, that research then affect our work? So there's a direct connection there. So that's one piece. Another way that we partner is working with clients, and sometimes it's pro bono work or working with organizations that matter to us. So we have any number of kind of, design is a kind of apprentice experience, and where there's a need for people in our profession to teach each other, right? That's how people become graphic designers, interior designers, architects, landscape architects. And so in that vein, and being part of an apprentice kind of profession, we have lots of engagement with organizations that work with students in high school and at the university level. So that's a way that we work with different organizations. And that's sometimes a great thing to do with clients, like whether our clients are, I was thinking to Anna's point about all this space that is unused, my brain kind of went straight to, well, it feels like Anna and some brokers to get together, kind of, brokers are the ones who know all about what space. And so that feels like a whole, my brain was kind of firing on that. So I think that, and even now, I think if we imagine the past year with people being, way more focused and called forward to think about these issues, that our partners in construction, in brokerage, or say like the ULI, which is the national organization about urban issues, like everyone is really aware of like, how is our profession, which is focused on the built environment, doing or not doing something that's kind of dealing with equity, and that the work that we do in terms of building things and building infrastructure and building spaces has a huge impact on wealth building. And so I think that more and more there's work that we did before with partnerships, and I think those partnerships are expanding now because it matters more to people, I guess. So all to say, I guess our partnerships can sometimes be research level, and there can be really activity, like very action-based and focus on things we do together to make change. Yeah.
David, do you have anything to add as sort of the academic on the panel?
Sure. I mean, in a way, I feel I agree entirely with Anna and Lisa. In some ways, I think the model for this kind of public-private partnership is the modern American university. And so at the University of Pennsylvania, where I teach, there's a real emphasis on civic engagement. There's a school of design that has an architecture program where people are thinking about critical issues and are often working with nonprofits and firms outside of the university in order to develop creative solutions to problems of urban space and issues of affordability and access. We can think about sort of the way that translational medicine at Penn and other universities is a way in which the research, the sort of the research faculties of a university can partner with business in order to bring new innovative products to market. And so, I mean, so in a lot of ways we can think about, and the university itself is sort of nominally a nonprofit institution, but behaves very much like a for-profit institution. Perhaps it's the nonprofit institution that sort of runs itself more like a corporation than most other nonprofits. And of course, universities are full of semi-public spaces that offer a kind of co-working, whether it be in university libraries or classrooms or cafes. I mean, you can think of the university itself as a giant co-working space where people come to work collaboratively. And I think as more and more universities wind up civically engaging with their surrounding cities, their surrounding environments, local corporations and local neighborhoods, universities can be a place and a model for this kind of innovative thinking that Lisa and Anna are suggesting.
Yeah, I can't think of a sort of, we're at the close of the hour, a better way to end on this more optimistic note and on the possibilities, especially emanating here as we are from the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU, which is such a space for, bringing people from different sectors beyond just academia and working together. I mean, it will take all kinds of disciplines and partnerships. And, IPK has been one place in which we're really trying to get out research that's really meaningful and impactful to the broader community. And the shift here has been one of the spaces in which I think we've covered a range of different topics, today being about work, to sort of bring a broader conversation. So I really want to thank each and every one of you for providing insights and thoughts and ways that we can potentially move forward. I'm going to hand over the mic, so to speak, back to Jessica at IPK.
Thank you very much, Melissa, for that wonderful conversation. Lisa, Anna, and David, I can't thank you enough for joining us and sharing your thoughts and insights. And thanks to everyone who joined us from their devices, wherever you may be, for this conversation. If you joined late or you would like to find other IPK events, you can do so on our YouTube channel. NYU Institute for Public Knowledge. The live stream is also available on Twitter at NYU_IPK. And for details on the next episode of The Shift and other upcoming events,